Alrighty, so let's start our review for Unit 6. First, just as a reminder about our essential questions for the unit, right? We're talking about community and belonging, although in the first couple of days we were also connecting it to our previous unit on migration. And in a minute, we're going to talk about the first topic, which was the Syrian refugee crisis. So we will talk about that a little bit. But first, onto the EQs. So, what determines whether an individual or nation belong to a larger community? I want you guys to think about that with regard to certain nations deciding to join the EU over time, and then also in terms of the individual, we could consider actually the Syrian refugee crisis itself. To what extent should a community welcome outsiders? How does that limit their understanding of what a community is? Then, how and why do societies prioritize the needs of the individual and community? One thing that I think about with regard to this question, for an example, would be Brexit, right? Let's think about the ways in which the United Kingdom wants to still consider its own individual needs, how it does not want to be dwarfed by the greater demands of the European Union. And also, of course, we could extend this to, again, something like the Syrian refugee crisis, where we should consider the extent to which a society wants to protect the sort of individual priorities of someone from a different community and the priorities that were determined by the community before their entrance. How does ideological change impact political change? Again, Brexit comes to mind. We can think about the ways in which the trend towards nativism, anti immigration, has shaped a rightward political shift in a place like the United Kingdom. And then lastly, how can intellectual authority favor the individual or the community, or to strive to find a balance between the two? And so, in general, we could also think about schools of thought behind something like Brexit. We could consider the speaking activity that we had the last week of this unit, which you guys started on Friday, regarding the different leaders and their interpretation of what Brexit would mean, whether or not they support it. Okay, guiding questions. So, how did the formation of the EU change member nations? To what extent did they develop a common collective identity? So, we need to think about the ways in which EU enlargement either strengthened the EU or weakened it. And of course, we have our own different interpretations and perspectives on that. How have certain European nations struggled to maintain their national identity within the EU? And how have their respective populations responded to this? So, again, I think about Brexit in this. I also think about something like the Scottish referendum to leave the EU, and sort of how, when a community forms, in many ways they are sort of tabling their own individual identity in favor of a collective one. Does that present challenges to a community in maintaining their identity? And then lastly, how has migration and the presence of refugee and asylum seekers shaped the conversation about community and belonging within the EU? And the best way to talk about that question would be to launch into our first topic, which is the Syrian refugee crisis. And so this slide presents background, and then eventually we're going to connect it to Europe. So, when did it start? This is a very long conflict. It's been going on for 7 years now, and it began during the Arab Spring in the March of 2011. And the Arab Spring was a series of protests in the Middle East and North Africa, and many of them resulted in regime changes. So, for example, in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, there was actually a change in government. But in Syria, there was no change in government. Instead, the Assad regime responds by trying to brutally take down the rebels. And there's been an ongoing civil war for 7 years since because of that. So, because there was this anti-government demonstration in 2011, there was an organization formed by Syrian army defectors called the Free Syrian Army later on that year. And what they were trying to do was rebel against the Assad regime, but the Syrian government launched a counter offensive against that. And now the conflict has become much more complex. It's a multi sided conflict. Essentially, there are four different groups fighting, and they're not fighting for the same reasons. So you have the Assad regime, right? The state in power, the rebel factions, such as the Free Syrian Army, rather, and others have formed since then. ISIS also is trying to take advantage of this conflict, and they have intervened and they control some, albeit limited, territory within the Syrian state. And then also Kurdish forces. Now, the Kurds identify as a completely different ethnicity from the rest of Syria, and also the other nations that border Syria that have a Kurdish population, and they want to form their own separate nation, Kurdistan, and so they're also trying to fight for their own independence within this conflict. So, needless to say, it's very complicated, and it's resulted in massive displacement of people from the region. So, as of April 2018, oh, actually, another thing I wanted to mention about these four different factions fighting is consider how this links to identity, also belonging in this community, and the clash of cultures and ideologies this entails. So, to what extent do people that live in this region feel like they have a sense of belonging to begin with? Moving forward, as of April 2018, 11 million Syrians have left their homes, and ongoing violence has resulted in 5.6 million Syrian refugees fleeing the country, and another 6.1 internally displaced people. So think ahead to our theme. Consider how this crisis has affected one's sense of belonging in Syria. If so many people have left, even people who've remained, what is their sense of community and belonging when their community becomes a shell of what it once was? And speaking of which, let's zero in on one region in Syria that's been experiencing uh, quite a crisis, especially as of late. So the fighting in Syria intensified by 2015 as other parties have become involved, and these are larger parties like the US, Russia, and Turkey. And so they become involved by supporting um, and opposing various factions. So the US has become increasingly involved because they want to fight ISIS presence in the area. And Russia is involved because they support the Assad regime. So essentially the US and Russia are at odds with regard to this conflict. So consider the extent to which this has become a proxy war between larger superpowers. We see this affecting certain localities acutely. So, eastern Ghouta, which is very near the Syrian capital of Damascus, has been under siege ever since 2013. And because of that, residents have had little to no access to food or medical supplies. And just in the past month, 130,000 people have fled their homes in eastern Ghouta. And this was previously a rebel stronghold, although recently the Syrian government has taken over this area. And this is the area where there were the recent alleged chemical attacks. So again, connect this to community and belonging, right? Eastern Ghouta is a shell of what it once was, and this creates a large group of displaced people who are longing for a safe place with freedom to work and receive an education. And where are they increasingly turning to? Some more stable places like Europe. So that links us ultimately to our new topic, and that's what we'll pick up in the next videos. But what we're seeing is many Syrian refugees at first were heading to locations in surrounding Middle Eastern countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. They were hoping that this conflict, once it ended, they could just return to their homes, so they wanted to remain nearby. But Jordan and Lebanon are the smallest countries in the region, and they lack infrastructure to handle this many more refugees that are coming in there. There have been about 1.5 million Syrian refugees who have fled there during the civil war. So consider, for example, how many refugees are already in these regions due to other conflicts, like the Israeli Palestinian conflict, which we studied previously this year. Iraq also has been dealing with its own internal struggles, and it has 2.6 million internally displaced Iraqi citizens. So this means that many Syrians are fleeing the region altogether. They're abandoning the hope that this conflict is going to end anytime soon. So they're crossing into places like Turkey, and many of them try to continue on to destinations in Europe where there are more work opportunities. But we need to think about how population pressures and lack of resources further hinders any sense of belonging for Syrian refugees. So they press onward. They no longer feel like they can achieve any sense of belonging in a place like Jordan, right? For example, this shows you the overcrowded, sprawling conditions of the refugee camps. So they're longing to go to a place where they have more of a sense of home, where they can create a new sense of belonging. So why are they going to Europe? Again, like I mentioned just now, there's little to no sign that the conflict in Syria is ending anytime soon. And so they're losing hope and they don't stick around to the nearby places anymore because they're relegated to substandard living conditions. They're living in these overcrowded refugee camps. And most of them have little to no opportunity to work or receive an education in these regions, so they just slip deeper into poverty. So children are unable to receive an education in most of these regions, again, due to the severe lack of infrastructure. And many of these children have been out of school for months, if not years. And also, Europe is a key destination for many of these people because it's sort of seen as a beacon of hope in the news and social media. It is generally perceived as a more welcoming place with more job and education prospects. So, Germany, for example, has had a declining birth rate in recent years, and it's in need of foreign workers to bridge this gap. But to what extent might this sense of welcoming change as the flow of migrants increases? And we know that this is the case, and we'll talk about how this affects things like Euroscepticism in future review videos, right? The other problem for establishing any sense of community and belonging in Europe is that just getting to Europe is increasingly difficult. So, this connects a lot to what we previously talked about with migration. Refugees are paying exorbitant fees to traffickers for this journey, so we can think about how that compares to the story of Mexicans paying the coyotes extreme fees for a very risky journey. They take overcrowded dinghies normally that make the very short trip, even from a place like Turkey to Greece, incredibly dangerous. So, for example, almost 4,000 refugees, and this isn't just Syrians, this is also people from North Africa, have died just since the beginning of 2018. So, the question this begs is what what should the international community do to respond to this crisis? Is it their responsibility to take some sort of responsibility for these displaced people? To what extent should they welcome them into their community? Also, this is really affecting European attitudes. The difficulty of reaching their destination has increased, which reflects the extent to which Europeans are no longer feeling welcoming of these displaced people. So most refugees are aiming farther north to places like Germany, which have good job prospects and accept more asylum applicants. But the problem is that other nations are closing their doors, which makes it increasingly difficult to make it far enough to places like Germany or even the UK in search of work. Hungary has built fence along its border with Serbia to try to deter refugees, and other countries have since followed suit. So, as you see in this map, we're seeing increasing barriers. So, refugees are forced to take alternative routes. Uh, Greece, so Greece is also facing its own financial crisis, so it can't process that many migrants. Many of them are forced to live in tent cities in ports like Lesbos. So we could also ask the question about whether they feel at all welcome, whether they can establish any sense of community and belonging if they're relegated to living conditions like this. So this begs the question, is it right for these nations to resist migration? We could again look forward to the themes of community and belonging. Consider the extent to which nations like Hungary and Greece, and of course other nations like the UK, are turning inward, making it difficult for others to belong. Nearly 90,000 unaccompanied minors, 13% of them are children younger than 14, have sought asylum in the EU in 2015 alone. So we could ask, is it the responsibility of others to take in minors as refugees, or should our sense of community and belonging extend beyond our national borders? And then lastly, just connecting it to our new theme, and then we'll pick up with video two. So last unit we studied migration, right? So now that we're familiar with the migration story out of Europe, think about how this sense affects one's sense of community and belonging, right? When you're displaced from your previous community, can you establish a new community? Can you be welcomed into another group? To what extent do you have to assimilate into another people's sense of community, or can you maintain your previous identity when you relocate? How might the identity of peoples living in the EU change over time with these recent developments? Can an identity morph into one that is more welcoming of diversity? And to what extent do challenges such as migration and economic pressure affect community and belonging in the EU? So, as we're moving forward into events like the Eurozone debt crisis, as the Syrian refugee crisis only becomes worse, how is this affecting the way in which the EU defines its community? So, we're going to stop here and then we'll transition into our overview of what the EU is. So, stay tuned for that, and thanks.